Hey YouTube, it's Will from Will Development. Today we're going to talk about a controversial topic in the stone making business. Now, we've all seen some warnings if you've ever gone to one of the best, if not the best resource for strongman news, training, tips, tricks, form checks, equipment manufacturing, starting strongman. And if you've delved into the forums like I have, looking for new tips and new ideas on how to make stones, not only as efficiently as possible, but to make the best stone, the highest quality stone possible. Now, being that I'm somebody who actually makes stones for people, for all kinds of people, I'm always trying to improve my craft, always trying to create the best possible product and end result that I can. So with that in mind, I've dove into the forums every once in a while and keep an eye out for people, and anytime a post comes up where somebody's asking for advice on how to make their first Atlas stone and tips and tricks and would this be right, would that be wrong, that sort of thing, a topic always seems to come up, and that's the topic of concrete vibrators. Some people call them pencil vibrators. For the purposes of this video, we're going to always be referring to it as a concrete vibrator. And there's always some pretty strong opinions either direction. Now, personally, when I read these comments, some people get pretty heated about it. I feel like a lot of the warnings come from a good place. People warning about over vibrating it and giving advice on why you don't want to use a concrete vibrator. So then the question becomes, why do concrete vibrators even exist if not to make the best quality concrete there is? And the question in my mind that always came up was just that. What is the purpose of a concrete vibrator? Why would you need to vibrate the concrete? And does it actually do more harm than good? I'm going to put some resources from research that I actually found while making this video. By the way, when you do science, you should do research before you start your experiments, just to see if somebody else has already answered this question. I would also make that recommendation before you go blasting people on social media for their opinions. Do a little research first. That's some life advice for you. One, where it was a study done by Minich Manufacturing, and they did a study on vibration and its effects on concrete. Why is vibration of concrete necessary? From the American Concrete Pavement Association. Seems like a pretty good resource for somebody in masonry, if you ask me. Concrete consolidation, tips for choosing the right vibrator type for the application, from forconstructionpros.com. Not sure if they're trying to sell you anything, but they talk about stuff. I'll also link a resource to a study somebody did. My gut says Africa. I don't have that particular piece of research in front of me. I was sent it by somebody else. I have it saved somewhere, but I can't find it exactly at this moment. It will be linked below. They did a study on concrete vibration and how it works and the quality of the concrete after. Now, all of these resources I point to actually discuss the purpose of vibrating, advantages and disadvantages of it, and the proper use of them. But one of the most interesting things I had seen on a comment was a discussion about the purpose of a concrete vibrator, and they had said that the purpose of concrete vibrating was to actually bring the cream to the top. Well, that was the purpose, to bring the cream to the top, which I was under the impression that the purpose of vibrating concrete was to decrease the amount of friction between the molecules in the mixture, therefore decreasing the amount of air suspended in the mixture. That's actually not what I thought. That's actually an exact quote from one of those articles where they discuss the exact proper use and purpose of a concrete vibrator. There's also another article linked there where they discuss strength of concrete over the years and why it is now actually required. Again, structural integrity gets increased because you have less air suspended in the mixture, therefore it is more compressed, ergo better. And then there's always the big one of the aggregate will settle and you will have an uneven stone. You'll have one side that's weaker than the other. Don't recall ever seeing a comment about basically the aggregate sinking to the bottom, which would cause a very uneven stone, which in my opinion might be advantageous. I mean, you figure if you train on a stone that's super uneven and kind of wobbly, and then you go to a stone that's nice and balanced, it's probably going to be easier to work with. Training should always be harder than competition. Yeah, so I encourage you to check out the resources that I've linked down below. If after watching this video you still kind of just don't, I don't want to say don't believe me, but you don't agree with the findings of this particular experiment, then I encourage you to check out those other resources from professionals and their opinions on proper use, as well as some of the history behind it, and some of the findings that they have made during their courses of experiments that they've done. And we're talking about people that are doing this for big money and for buildings that need to be able to stand. You know, I'm going to go by that. If I'm going to be making stones for people, I want to know that I'm doing the best possible job that I can. So to answer that question, I've come up with a bit of an experiment. Not even a bit, it is an experiment, because I'm writing it down, so it's science. So for today's experiment, we're going to be pouring approximately 4 inches of 5,000 psi concrete into 10 different tubs. Each container is going to get a light dusting of silicone spray. 2 of them will get 0 tamping. Essentially, I'm just going to put them into the container and just press it into place. 2 of them will get a tamping with just a hammer, a rubber mallet, and I'm going to use the same methodology I would use as if I was making a stone, which is 50 per each quarter, so a total of 200 bumps into each side to settle it. Another set will be vibrated with a concrete vibrator for approximately 30 seconds, which is what most people I think would argue is a safe amount of time. The final set of 2 will be vibrated for 5 minutes of total vibration time. I'm gonna let it all cure for the industry standard, which is 28 days for 4 inches of concrete. After that 28 days, what I'm probably gonna end up doing is using a grinding wheel to cut halfway through, and then a chisel to just kind of snap it open. And with that, we will then look and visually see how much aggregate is actually sunk in and how far. But I'll show everybody the results and you guys can just make your own determinations from there. Unable to find the lot number on these bags, but they both came from the same pallet, so I just have to assume that they were from the same lot of production for the 5,000 psi. Today we're going to be using Quikrete brand. Again, I'm trying to keep this as similar to my stone making as possible, and this is the brand of 5,000 psi concrete I use for all of my stones, so it should match up pretty well. A 1.5 pound Pittsburgh brand rubber mallet for the tamping. All of the containers are going to be kept in similar environments, which in this case will be the Florida natural humidity and or weather, and in a relatively shaded area. Blaster silicone lubricant to slightly lubricate every single container with a very light dusting in each one, just like I would do for my molds. Each container will be labeled and covered after it has been vibrated or not vibrated down. For containers, we'll be using 10 Sterlite branded polypropylene containers. I don't know the plastic that molds are made out of. These should be very good and or close to the type of material that the molds are made out of. If not, it's still going to give us a really good test. We're going to be using a Chicago electric concrete vibrator, which vibrates at 13,000 vibrations per minute. It is 120 volts, approximately 60 hertz, and 3/4 horsepower. Let's start mixing and pouring. That was fun. I ended up only doing 1 container of the hand tamp. All of them I put about 20 pounds in each one, plus or minus half a pound, give or take, was what I was shooting for as a tolerance there. Now, one of the reasons I'm not that concerned with only having 1 container of the hand tamp is because that's not really the point of this experiment at all. Most people aren't going to argue that you could hand tamp something down too much. Again, I understand that this particular experiment might not translate exactly over to stones, but given that the industry standard for most concrete measurements is 4 inches minimum, this is a good test for that, and in my opinion, you'll be able to scale that. Now, one of the things I did want to talk about is my hypothesis, and my hypothesis is that there's really no amount of vibrating you could possibly do to cause a significant aggregate ratio change. Part of that is evident when you saw the concrete being vibrated. Some of the aggregate, in fact, rose to the top because it was so light. Another reason I don't think it's a problem is because I overpour all my stones. That way there's a nub on top, and all that does is guarantee that the top has been filled fully, and it avoids being a very noticeable flat spot. Even after grinding, there's material there to work with where I can make it sort of rounded. I don't want a huge flat spot on the bottom of the stones that I make, so I like there to be a lot of material to work with, because you can always take some off, but you can't always put more back on. So it's one of those things I like to do. Since I vibrate every stone that I make down to the last pour, the last cupful that I pour in, every time I grind off that nub, there is always aggregate showing there. And it appears to be the same ratio of aggregate to cement that anywhere else in the stone had shown. So Vibrator's vibrating at 13,000 vibrations per minute, which means at 30 seconds you're only vibrating 6,500 times. The difference between that and, say, hammer method is 6,000 or so vibrations, 6,300 vibrations. The only difference between vibrating it with your hand or vibrating it with a mechanical tool is the frequency of vibrations. I don't see how the frequency of vibrations could increase the chance of aggregate sinkage. It doesn't really make sense to me. It's just, all it is a matter of how many vibrations you've done. By that logic, if I vibrated the material by hand for 13,000 vibrations, regardless of time, but just vibrated it 13,000 times, it should produce the same result as a concrete vibrator. And I just don't see that being the case. Now, arguably, the only thing I'm missing here is using some sort of other mechanical vibrating tool, such as some people use palm sanders, putting the heel of it on the stone to vibrate the concrete. Some people will take a car buffer and put that on the outside of the mold to cause vibrations. My logic would be that that's the same thing as a concrete vibrator, because it's moving at so many more vibrations per minute. Now, arguably, the concrete vibrator is moving at 13,000 vibrations per minute. A sander or buffer is more than likely moving at a lot less vibrations per minute, but what that number is, I don't know. I would have to run another experiment. Hopefully these containers survive the extraction process of this experiment, and if they do, then I'll be able to reuse them, and we can go again, and I'll actually do the experiment again, comparing a minute of vibration with a concrete vibrator to a minute of vibration with a sander or a buffer. So, I got my nerd glasses on, and I got my hat because Florida is closer to the sun than any other place on the planet, and the glasses give me +2 to intellect, which brings my intellect right up to about 2.5, because today we're going to do some science. Technically, I've been doing science this whole time because I've been writing it down. What I have at the table that you can't see right now, but the table right below me, is all the blocks that have been split relatively in half. You saw the footage of me marking them and cutting them and then using a chisel to snap them in half. What we're looking for is the amount of aggregate at the bottom versus at the top of the blocks. These blocks have been curing in a controlled environment for about 2.5, almost 3 months. So these are definitely cured by, I would say, anybody's standards. And what I'm going to do next is spray all of them off. That will do a couple things. One, it'll get rid of all the dust we have, and you'll be able to better see the actual aggregates that's sitting in the split pieces. Every single piece at the thinnest point is about 3.5 inches. The question is, can this scale up? And I would argue yes. What we're going to do is, like I said, wash all these off and then draw a line relatively centered and count the aggregate at the top and come up with a percentage of exposed aggregate that sank below center line and the percentage that stayed above center line, and then we will be able to compare those to the various methods that I used. There's a few problems with the experiment that I ran, and I'm acknowledging them now, so when people don't pay attention to this part, I can refer them to this section of the video where I say, yes, I knew that was problems with this particular video. Some of the problems that are going to be in this experiment are, one, if we're trying to scale this up to stones, really it should be done with a 24-inch deep test subject. Biggest stones that are made are generally 24 inches. That's usually the largest you can make. I do have a 24-inch mold. It might be something I can do someday, but I have no idea how I would possibly split that thing open to take a peek at it. So I acknowledge that right out of the gate, but I feel like this experiment could still be scaled, especially since I'm using percentages to represent a lot of the information. Two, I was aiming to do at least 4-inch thick pieces, because the industry standard that most concrete standards are built off of is 4 inches. Most of the experiments are done on things like curing times. PSI is also judged generally on a 4-inch thick piece. The pieces that I have are at minimum 3¼ inches, so we're missing about 0.75 inches or 3/4 of an inch, give or take. But again, I still feel like it's valid because you can scale these numbers up. The third problem with this experiment was the method that I had to use to actually split them open. What I ended up having to do was take a grinder with a cutoff wheel and actually score essentially about 1.5 inches, and then take a chisel and just bang it with a hammer to split it open. If I could do this experiment the way I want to do it, I would have had a blade on a saw that was able to cut through it cleanly all the way through, and I would have nice clean cuts on both halves to show. Cutting through it and splitting it the method that I used is not likely. In fact, it's impossible for it to move any aggregate. The only issue that could have come up, pieces of aggregate may have fallen out, 1 or 2 here or there. I don't think this is going to completely invalidate the entire experiment. Another thing that was wrong with my experiment was the actual methodology of how I was using the concrete vibrator. You're supposed to essentially insert it with no vibration, turn it on, and move it around, and very slowly move it around if you move it around. You also want to try to lay the vibrator down as much as possible, having the most of the tip that actually vibrates submerged in the concrete as possible. This is the last one that I have a big problem with, is that the method that I used to count the actual aggregate was literally just me sitting there wetting it down and counting it. I'm a human. I'm more than capable of making errors. If you want to count it yourself, you're welcome to. I would say if I was to do it again, the way I would probably do it was upload it into some sort of software, each picture of each half, and then put little dots on every single piece of aggregate. The other problem is, what do you call aggregate? Is that aggregate? Is that not? Basically, the way I did it was, if I thought it could possibly be aggregate, I counted it. And those are really the only big problems I see with this particular experiment and the methodology of it. Other than that, I still feel like the results can be scaled. You can kind of visually look at each piece and sort of make a judgment call and go, you know what, that looks pretty even. And sometimes you look at them and you're like, there's no way that's even. I mean, there's tons of space here that's not occupied by any aggregate. And other ones you can see, it looks pretty even to me. After going through the data, which you just saw, is it data or data? Fight in the comments. I am confident in sticking with my original theory that utilizing a concrete vibrator correctly will not negatively impact the concrete you're working with, and it will only make it better quality. The 30-second vibrations, which is honestly still on the high side of low, or the low side of high, depending on how you look at things, was the most consistent, had no air pockets that I could find on the inside, but on the outside of the exterior, there was very few air pockets there. And the ones that were there were tiny. I mean, we're talking centimeters in diameter at most. Not even that much, that's still too much. Millimeters. Had to measure them in that. I guess 1/8 of inches if you're in America and use proper metrics. That's an ironic sentence. And with the 5-minute ones, we had almost no discernible air pockets anywhere in any of the 5-minute stones. Feel free to leave a comment if you want to have a discussion about this, which is what the point of this video is to try to drive discussion on this topic. Leave it down below. I do my best to reply to all comments. Sometimes it's weird and I don't see them until like Friday, and sometimes it puts them in the spam folder. It's weird, but I try to reply to every comment I get on this channel. If you want to have a discussion about it, I'm more than open to have a discussion. If somebody feels like there was other problems with the experiment, I'm more than open to hear ideas. Just be relatively polite about it. If you start name calling, I'm probably not going to respond to you because, just because your feelings are hurt because you were wrong doesn't mean I have to respond to you. So just keep that in mind when you're leaving a comment. Let's have a discussion about this. Maybe you do your own count on the stones that you see. You come up with a completely different data set. I'm more than open to that. Again, that is one of the biggest problems with this experiment, was the way I was sort of shackled to counting, but I wanted some sort of empirical type of data. And I'm not saying nothing would change my opinion right now. I've made a lot of stones in the time that I've been making them. Ever since I started using concrete vibrators, vibrating, I've never had a problem with any of those stones. To be fair, I never had the ones that I used a hammer tan for. I think if anything, it's just going to make it better. Share this around with your fellow stone makers, and if you don't, then what's your excuse?